Margaret Lee, Special People and Places. We are north of Muscle Shoals.
We actually are in the east end of Muscle Shoals. It's kind of the county part of Muscle Shoals. And we are at a point called Bainbridge here, where the old Bainbridge Ferry used to run, and it was the dividing point between what was called the Big Muscle Shoals, where the river flowed over big rapids coming from Decatur downriver. And from this point southward is called the Little Muscle Shoals. So this is indeed the true heart of what was the original Muscle Shoals.
Oh my.
Now the mussels, you know, are these little shellfish that grew in the river, and the Indians would harvest them. That was a diet from the early primitive Indians here, and they would actually build big mounds with just the mussel shells. So when TVA first flooded the river here.
About what year, Joel?
This is in the 1930s. This is after Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided that there needed to be a master plan to use some of the facilities that were built here in World War I and put people to work in the South. And so the WPA and others came in and did a lot of work, and archaeologists were hired to look at all the Indian remains that were out in the river. And roughly between, say, 10 miles north of here to 10 miles south of here, they actually uncovered about 100 skeletons of the ancient Indians, a lot of Indian artifacts. The Indians did ceremonial burials in these mounds. And if you haven't seen it, you'll want to make a trip to see the Indian Mound Museum in Florence. It's just been kind of fully redone, and it's got some marvelous presentations of what the early Indian life was like here. And the Indians indeed inhabited this area as long as 10 to 12,000 years ago. And we know that because of diggings that have been done. We're going to be passing by the LaGrange Historical Preservation Area where Indian Cave Shelter was located. There's another over further west in the county that's known as the Stanfield Worley Dig, which is real famous. The very first radiocarbon dating ever done in Alabama was done here in 1961 to date the Indian campfires, if you will, from that particular location. So this is a very historic place, and it's had people in and out of here for 10 to 12,000 years. And indeed, it was a trading path between Mobile and the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, because a lot of the trinkets found in the mounds here come from those distant places. So you know they had to have a trading system in order to get those trade goods into here.
Okay, now the old Byler Road, did that start here?
The old Byler Road, which was Alabama's first authorized road by the state. There were a couple of pioneer trails in here before the Byler, but the pioneer was determined as needed and to be built 2 days after Alabama became a state. The state legislature was meeting in Huntsville, and they put this as a priority of something that needed to be done. So the Jackson Military Road was just being completed. It was built between 1816 and 1820. So the specification by the legislature was that the Byler Road was to start on the west bank of Shoals Creek. And Shoals Creek is out right over here. So west bank of Shoals Creek, but it's about 10 miles north of the riverbank over there, was where the Jackson Military Road crossed Shoals Creek. So it came down there through Bailey Springs and ended up in what's called North Bainbridge on the other side of the river. And then there was a narrows here, which was the narrowest part of the Tennessee River, which was a channel, and you could cross in about 15 minutes here. And so Campbell put in a ferry here before Alabama became a state, and that was called Campbell's Ferry. And you take Campbell's Ferry, and then the road was built north of Campbell's Ferry up to the crossing of Jackson Military Road at Shoals Creek, and south of here all the way to Tuscaloosa, but through this point. So we'll be riding on this road, this very historic road, earliest in Alabama. There actually was a road here before statehood from the foot of Campbell's Ferry here, a little bit to the southwest of here, and it intercepted an even earlier road called Gaines Trace. Gaines Trace was a road 1808 and 1810. So some 10 years before statehood, the Gaines Trace got built. And George Washington was instrumental in negotiating the treaty for Gaines Trace to be built. And he built a cotton called Meldon's Bluff, 12 miles to the east of here, for the Cherokee Indians and Chief Doublehead. And then he built another cotton gin down at Cotton Gin Port, Mississippi, which he built for the one of the Chickasaw chiefs. And it was the Indians' bypass of the Shoals, because they too knew about the magic of cotton, and cotton was a wonderful material, very much in demand all over Europe, where they built these fancy mills to process cotton and make it into clothing. And so the highest and best price in the world for cotton was over there. And so the Indians got in on the act by building Gaines Trace, and a young Lieutenant, James Pendleton Gaines, surveyed that route. And it's important in the story of the Byler, because the Byler crosses the Gaines Trace. It was also important pre-Alabama. So we'll be talking about a little bit of all of that today. One little factoid I wanted to mention to you is that Jesse and Frank James robbed the U.S. government payroll at this point called Bainbridge here. Bainbridge was the first town that began to be built here on the Tennessee River, just prior to statehood and just after statehood. So it actually came along before Florence and Tuscumbia began to spring up. And it turned out that with Jackson Military Road, the population shifted there rather than here. So this was going to be the population center here of northwest Alabama, but it ended up being a little bit further downstream.
Okay.
All right. So Jesse and Frank got away with their bank robbery.
About what year was that?
The government was building a canal on the other bank, and this was, I don't know the exact year of that, but of course it was after the Civil War, when they were into their robbing trains and the like. And Jesse ended up dying before this came to trial, but Frank went on trial over in Huntsville, and he was defended and represented by one of the one of the Alabama governors, Governor Smith, out of Randolph County, Alabama. He was a carpetbagger governor. He was an son of Alabama, but during the Reconstruction period, Smith was one of our first governors, and he was a lawyer and defended Frank James, and Frank James got off with that robbery.
Oh my! Just a little tidbit.
Just a little tidbit. So one of the more important things about this location has to do with the Civil War period. Hood's army, as you know, was actually the residual army of General Johnston, Battle of Atlanta. And in effect, the city of Atlanta was given up so that the army could be saved. So the Union was allowed to go in and capture Atlanta, but the troops wanted to fight again. So they changed generals, and Hood took over. Recently written a little treatise. You'll find it on the Tennessee Valley Historical Society website that deals with the Palmer raid. So Union General Palmer, as Hood was retreating into this location, Palmer took a train out of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, down to Decatur. And the Confederates brought over some pontoon boats that they had left over at Decatur and put with those that Hood was bringing with him. Hood had to abandon a number of his pontoon wagons, so they didn't have enough pontoons to cross here. So they had to get the 20 or so pontoons out of Decatur in order to get across the river. They barely made it around Christmas Day of 1864. The weather was freezing. The men were wading streams to get back here. Their shirts were freezing on them. It was a pretty sad situation. So you had the tattered army crossing right here at Bainbridge and heading south with 310 wagons. All 310 wagons were run down by Union cavalry. 200 of them were run down just to the west of Russellville, 10 miles out of Russellville, and 200 wagons and about 1,000 mules were burned and the mules killed with bayonets. The 110 wagons were taken to Iuka, Mississippi, with the main force of the men. The wagons that got run down first were doing a cross country down the Gaines Trace. The other wagons were intercepted over in Mississippi, and they were burned, and those mules were bayoneted likewise. So it was a big loss for Hood's army, and it really set the stage for Alabama being very vulnerable to being invaded, which was done a few months later by General Wilson and his troops. So again, this is a very historic crossing and a very important part of the South final surrender.
All right, Joel, that's most interesting.
It's unkempt and it's been torn down. There was one, the fellow who lived in this old house here, lived here until the Korean War, and he went away. And there used to be a big cistern out there where they would feed water the horses for the stagecoach stop. And after the war, the stagecoach stop was turned into a church building for a number of years. But there was just one readable cemetery stone left some 20 years ago when people have reported to me, and it was for Sarah Peden, who died in 1861, and the legend around here is that she was poisoned by her slaves.
Oh my.
Yeah. Now whether that legend is true or not, God only knows. That she's buried in a little cemetery out there that's the Peden family cemetery. There are about 40 graves out there, 40 or 50. None of them, they've been kind of plowed over and torn up, and there's just a couple of cemetery stones left, and her stone has disappeared in the last 20 years.
But that cistern was nearby.
Cistern was right there in the middle of that field, and the big old Traveler's Inn, stagecoach house, if you will, was right there in the edge of that field.
The idea, the stagecoach line name?
Actually, the main stage operation was done around Larissa in Winston County. And the family of Ferrises operated the stage line from there, and they drove south to Tuscaloosa, and they drove north first here to the Tennessee River and up to the Jackson Military Road, and later they morphed the road over to Cortland because that became the legal center of this south of the river area.
Can we put a time frame on the period of time that operated?
Yes. First of all, John Byler, Captain John Byler, who was originally of North Carolina and built roads in North Carolina before the War of 1812 and the Creek Indian War, he was selected to be one of the major road builders of building the Jackson Military Road from New Orleans to Nashville. And that road was finished in 1820. He rolled over from building that road to building this road. So it was authorized in December 1819, but he began construction in 1820. And it took 4 years to build the road. So the road was completely finished by 1824, but actually it was semi-operational as early as 1822. So that's the time frame when that was done.
Okay, now these big trees, they look centuries old.
This is about 300 years old. The road is 200 years, so the road that we're traveling today is 200 years old. And so that was probably a good-sized tree when this road was built. And it is a kind of an unusual species here. It's not normally found here. It is a cherry bark oak, and its natural habitat is in the lower province of the Mississippi River from about Memphis south in the swampland along the Mississippi Delta and the Louisiana Delta, and that's where it normally grows. How it got here, nobody knows. But it is the largest of its kind in the state of Alabama. It's about 23 feet in circumference.
Well, it's impressive, and you notice it right away. I did.
You do. You see the limbs hanging to the ground. Those are unusual. I'd seen the live oak trees in Texas and Mobile and Biloxi and whatever that hang down like that, but it's unusual with limbs that grow to the ground like these have. On either side of the road, as we go the next half mile, that the road is depressed. It's got banks up on either side, and you can see the tree roots growing from the bank down into the road. And that is classic of a road that's been there a long time. And remember, those 310 wagons that crossed at Bainbridge came right down this road. And as they did, every time those wheels turned, they picked up a little more mud, and that mud would kind of go with them, and that's what makes a depression like that in the old roads.
My.
Okay.
But the very beginning was at the edge of the river? Up there.
The very beginning is actually north there in Lauderdale County, but it wasn't convenient for us to go do that section.
Oh, okay.
And that runs from the Jackson Military Road at Shoals Creek, and it came down through Bailey Springs to North Bainbridge, which is on the north side of the river, and we were standing on the south side of the river where the main Bainbridge town was located. But that's about 10 miles of upper road that we didn't visit. So we started as far north as you can get in Colbert County, and now we're following the track that takes us to Tuscaloosa, because this road was built to take people to Tuscaloosa. You've got 100 feet of water depth there that's held up by the Wilson Dam. The Wilson Dam was built to be 142 feet tall, and so that stretch of river is considered one of the greatest natural resources of the United States, because it has enough drop in the river and enough water flow through the river to make a wonderful source for hydroelectric power. Thus, 2 dams got built. The Wheeler Dam upstream was built and put into operation in 1936, but the Wilson Dam started actually in World War I, and it was finished in 1924. So the 2 of those dams in combination make a huge amount of electricity, around 750,000 horsepower or thereabouts of electrical power.
Quite a power source.
As you know, Alabamans are enterprising people themselves and build a side road off to the side to skirt around the toll booths.
Do you know some of those? I had heard Cheatham Road was one.
Yeah, Cheatham Road ended up being a competing road that came down through Moulton to Double Springs and then on to Tuscaloosa. So it was a competing one that was built about 4 years after the Byler Road.
Okay, that answers a lot of questions from local people in Walker County.
Yes.
Walker, Winston, we're right on the line.
Roadways and trails, particularly the Byler Road, was a central way of traveling to the heart of Alabama. So the Wilson's cavalry troops actually organized themselves downstream of here over at Waterloo and a place called Gravelly Springs in Lauderdale County. They crossed the river at Cherokee and a place called Chickasaw or Riverton, and then they came down through the Byler and also through another road called the Gaines Trace Fork into Russellville, and from there they then went on into Jasper, and from Jasper they actually went in 3 prongs down to Jasper. They had a prong that came down the Somerville Road to Arkadelphia, headed for Jasper. They had a main group coming. Actually, General Wilson followed this group down the Byler Road here into the Bankhead Forest, and while in the Bankhead Forest, he was with Upton's 2nd Division, and Upton went on down straight to Jasper by way of Clear Creek Falls. And however, General Wilson actually peeled off and went down to Townley, Alabama, which then had a different name. I've forgotten what Townley's name was during the war. And then the other group, Croxton and his raiders with McCord's 1st Division, went to Eldridge and then took a road from Eldridge into Jasper, and they all converged at Jasper, and from Jasper is where the main campaign south was launched. So all of this ties in. These are feeder roads coming in to the heart of Alabama, and there's a lot of history on these roads and the horses and the men. The convoy of Hood's army, when he was retreating out of the Battle of Nashville, the 19,000 men he had left, was over 10 miles long. So this is a long convoy of men and wagons and animals, etc.
On the Byler Road.
On the Byler Road. On the Byler Road, crossing at Bainbridge which is part of the Byler. Well, before there was the University of Alabama, there was this LaGrange College that was established here in northern Alabama with prestigious educators coming in from across the country to live here and teach here, and students assembling here. Now, the college stayed available as a male college, if you will, up into the 1850s. But in the mid-1850s, it was determined to convert it to a military college. So it became the LaGrange Military College. This is also known as the West Point of the South. So that a number of Confederate soldiers were trained here, but believe it or not, some of the Yankee soldiers were trained here as well. So, for instance, one of the generals, McCord, of the Union forces was educated here along with some of his southern compatriot generals, colonels, etc. And part of what happened is that the Byler Road morphed over to this location because it became a center of activity and really with more enterprise and commerce than the little town of Leeton. So there was quite a community roundabout. There's an old cemetery down here, which was the LaGrange Town Cemetery, that's quite sizable in nature, and so you can see some of the history from that. It also is at the location of one of the early North American Indian sites. So that on the National Historic Register, the LaGrange Rock Shelter, which is just over the hill there, we actually passed by it. There's a road going straight up the hill. If we'd taken that another quarter of a mile, we'd have gotten to the point of the LaGrange Rock Shelter. That was excavated by University of Michigan students and professors back in the 1950s, as I recall. So in any event, this is a very, very historic area, and it ended up pulling the Byler and the traffic from the Byler here, and then traffic flowed out the south end of this town site location down to a place called Stout's Crossing, and from there it intercepted the old Gaines Trace and went into Russellville. There's also a LaGrange road that goes into Old Bethel, a cemetery stop that will be taken after this one, and Old Bethel is a location of convergence of some of the major old roads as well. So we'll be able to see that later. What a sterling location this was, so that you could, from vantage points here, see what's going on in the entire Tennessee Valley from this perch point here.
It's beautiful. And Joel, I like the way they've done this rustic little village that they've done here as a campground, would you say, Joel?
Oh, well, it is a campground, and it pulls a lot of people into a couple of festivals they have every year. Lisa Pace may be able to tell us more about the festival here. I think she's been involved in it, but it certainly is a Civil War heritage location.
Oh, what a beautiful, beautiful setting.
What was that, or was it just a...
It's a cabin that's been restored from some other area and brought in. The college was destroyed in 1863 when Colonel McCornan's troops came in. They burned the campus because they considered it to be useful for the opposition to continue to train soldiers, etc. And so basically, during that time, they were actually on a campaign of utter destruction throughout this Tennessee Valley area. And so the early penetration in 1862 and 1863 by the Union Army here after the Battle of Shiloh, they pretty much destroyed all factories, all buildings that could be used against them in the Civil War.
Joel, do you know anything about the law? It says built in 1857, so it was a member of the Looney family anyway.
I have an 1830 in Tuscumbia, and it's underlain by major beam supports under the house. It looked just about like that one. So you see all the old axe marks, etc. And so that's the pioneers
That massive?
built these old houses with very massive foundations.
When you look out on the horizon right over there, so that's where the river is, there's that tower. That's the Renaissance Tower. And so that, yep, so that marks the actual Tennessee River. So you can see far past Florence from this location. So this area was strategic due to its, they actually came up here to fight off malaria. Did he talk about that?
No.
The town was in Layton, and it was hot and humid in the summers. And so they would actually come up to the mountain. They thought it was cooler, and for some reason they thought there was less malaria and yellow fever epidemics up here. So they used this as a retreat, and there were some springs, as he was talking about, where the Indian rock shelter is, and those springs were kind of like healing health springs, like spas. So they were very modern even then.
Now, I mentioned the enterprising Alabamians earlier. There's a fellow by the name of Billy Ray Dawson that owns the property adjacent to the Indian Bluff Shelter, and he currently has a distillery located on the site where he's legally making whiskey after coming from several generations of illegal whiskey makers.
It's called the Spirit of the Mountain. Spirits of the Mountain. And he ties it back to our Native American heritage. He is in the rock shelter area with those fresh springs. So he does call it Spirits of the Mountain, and it refers to spirits as well as the Native American heritage that we have so strong in this area.
And the spring water is just trickling out at the bottom of the bluffs, and he's collecting that and using fresh spring water to make all of his spirits with.
Oh, how healthy.
He also happens to be a descendant of the Campbells. I mentioned Campbell's Ferry at Bainbridge was the very first ferry in the area. Living all about this mountain along the rim of it are the Campbell family, still living here today.
Another thing of interest is that these soils here have all the necessities to promote petrification. So there's been several petrified living organisms here, from human bodies in the cemetery to actually trees. The trees are on display now at Spring Park in Tuscumbia, but the petrification and minerals that are needed for that all occur here on the mountain. And it may be why the springs were used as healing springs, because they had some of those petrification minerals in them. So it might have actually been some fountain of youth type scenarios going on here.